I'm Miles Glendinning. I'm based at Edinburgh, at University of Edinburgh. I'm Professor of Architectural Conservation. We sort of run a Masters in Conservation here, but most of my own personal research is about like modern or contemporary architecture, or both like history of 20th century architecture, or but also some contemporary architectural issues or issues in heritage and so on as well. So that, I kind of publish various things about that. My main research at the moment is about the history of mass housing. I think Matthew is somebody with a very strong sense of mission. If the word arrogant is obviously a bit much of semantics, but if the word arrogant is more like a more aggressive kind of thing, well, certain types of the more individualistic modern architects who are more egotistic. But we had to interview Dennis Last and Alison Smithson, and they both seemed to me very arrogant people. They were loud-mouthed architects who were, very convinced about their own importance and just being prepared to be quite rude. I'm not sure that Matthew was quite the same sort of character, really. I mean, he's certainly probably arrogant very much below the surface, but was maybe a bit more urbane. And this is probably what might have recommended him to the sort of governing elite in the time in Northern Ireland, that he wouldn't seem to be somebody who was a loud, swaggering kind of person. He was somebody who was, on the one hand had self-assurance, but he was able to convey that in a somewhat quiet way that wasn't aggressively flamboyant or something like that. I suppose during the course of the research, that was the time that the sort of neo-modernist architecture started, and I became very much kind of convinced that that was rather very different from the original modernism, and the aspects that it was most different from was not the sort of iconic people like Corbusier and so on, who really could be that could be rather easily appropriated by the new people as being kind of concerned with image and individualism, but the slightly more kind of organisational people like Matthew, who did everything by working in groups, and, even although he had a very strong sense of his own importance. The people who were questioning through a kind of avant-garde deconstructive type of things, of the Team 10 or the Smiths, that was completely alien to him. I mean, his way of tempering the sort of more rigid modernism was through, on the one hand, things that were older, like the arts and crafts, or the sort of liking for sort of stately gestures and that kind of thing, and then on the other hand, conservation. When Matthew wrote his lyrical stuff in the report about the landscape of Ulster, and I think any writing of that sort in one of these plans would have been slightly with Geddes in mind, but only a bit in mind. I think Geddes was really just rhetoric. I think a lot of Geddes' ideas were rhetoric anyway, but when they were then cited by modernist people, gave them the feeling that it was somehow linked to the place. He became involved because I think that the reason was that basically it was a planning assault on Belfast Corporation and on its sort of ideological and practical sort of conservatism, its reluctance to build housing, its etc., etc. And the planners and the kind of progressive people, and Oliver and Ronald Green, they managed to manoeuvre McKee, and there was a particular meeting where they managed to manoeuvre him into a corner, whereby they trapped him and got him to say that he wouldn't mind having the boundaries sort of put into question, providing somebody was brought in to do an external evaluation of it. And then Oliver said we seized on this straight away, and they sort of phoned up Matthew kind of straight away and kind of got him to come over the next day, just before the Belfast Corporation could have second thoughts about it. And the Belfast was sort of stuck, and they then had this person brought in who was treated as being very, very grand, and they then found themselves gradually sort of pushed into a corner. Matthew would be very experienced with this, because Exactly the same thing was done with Glasgow Corporation in the 1950s by the Central Government Planning Alliance. Now, in Scotland, the equation is totally different from the point of view of wanting to build lots of housing rather than not to build. Well, what Glasgow Corporation wanted to do in the 1940s was to build huge numbers of council housing within in the land it already had, in order to redevelop slums but keep the population and the rateable value while building homes for the people and all this socialism and etc. etc. Whereas what Belfast Corporation wanted to do was not to build any houses because it would create trouble. But the mechanism was the same, that they were kind of government administrators and planners with a kind of technocratic person and recalcitrant municipal people who wanted to obstruct enlightened mandarins, who were pursuing some enlightened mission. He would just have regarded Belfast Corporation as being just a rerun of Glasgow Corporation, but with a slightly different agenda of councillors who wanted not to do something rather than wanted to do it. I just wonder whether the whole thing was just a case of like Mandarin pyramid selling almost. That Oliver says in that Neil didn't want to go into smoky rooms and negotiate with people. He just wanted to sort of, say this is what's going to happen. To sort of have a few cronies in the newspapers and the people, the kind of elite people. Yeah, I mean, he certainly should have consulted the unionist politicians on the ground. I mean, I don't think this, the whole Skeffington idea, particularly in the circumstances of Northern Ireland, of, they should have public consultation. Nobody was thinking about that in 1964 when it all started going wrong. They should certainly have covered their back within the broad spectrum of sort of unionist opinion, But, it seems to me this was a very big structure that was built on a rather slender base of support. That this was not a structure that necessarily had a huge amount of coherence at the time, that there were people who were waiting to potentially, exploit the slightest problem. And then that Matthew kind of got carried away with them. And I think he also had this slightly sort of like a Scottish sort of like a colonialist attitude, potentially slightly to Northern Ireland, that this is a sort of tabula rasa something, And Matthew possibly wanted to leave, he saw it as something, why not? And just to go a bit further and then it was ultimately you had this enormous structure built up on this wobbly foundation, And I suspect these people, like Matthew would have seen himself as a very savvy person, but actually, politically they were quite naive. I think a lot of the parity people, the kind of, unionist liberals, would have seen their agenda being to bring into Northern Ireland the idea of class politics and Matthew, he would plenty of stuff about sociological analysis and so on, but the one really important one would be taboo. I mean, Matthew, as an architectural politician, it was second nature to him to really negotiate his way through with diplomacy through places where there was a lot of acrimony. He would have seen the latent situation in Northern Ireland as being quite apart from the fact that Edinburgh people would have seen sectarianism as being the Glasgow problem, and so they felt very superior about it. But there was at that stage in the when Matthew's upbringing, some sectarianism in Edinburgh. I mean, it was a sort of social movement in Edinburgh that was a little bit like fascism, and it was very much associated with a sort of radical Protestantism and so on. Matthew would have been aware of all this and would have kind of looked down on it all. With the Troubles, everybody would be, worried about that, but also Matthew had kind of just dropped out by then. It's a sort of a vicious circle that he kind of disappeared. The way he looked after number one was more sort of quiet and I think he stopped coming to Northern Ireland because he was afraid of actually, getting blown up or something, because he dropped out of all the stuff about the university from about 1970. He never came to any more meetings in Northern Ireland. He used to frequently come before then. Now, I think the moment that there was a whiff of trouble, he was out. The last point that he really was involved publicly was the UHS inaugural that in 1960. By 1968 he was out. So the moment the civil rights was coming up, he was already on the way out. Start off with the official area of the plan didn't include Londonderry, but he was pushing for it to be expanded into Ministry of Development. What he would be pressing for is the most grandiose kind of thing possible within the framework that he was given, and I think he would probably have been given to understand that bringing London Dairy into being far too contentious, both within unionism, within the different factions of and also in relation to the wider clash, so the wider tension. It was when it came to the new University of Ulster that really then it was much more on the agenda. By the time the university location had been discussed, things had moved on. The Ministry of Development was there, as opposed to where the plan was about the East. The way that architectural discourse works is by each movement pillaring its predecessor. Architectural discourse moves forward convulsively rather than through the kind of incremental thing of small-scale scientific discoveries or something like that. It moves by Group X rejecting the previous predecessors, and everything about the predecessors becomes bad. It's a sort of process of parodying and caricaturing, Since the 19th century, and it was really Pugin who started all of this off with the idea that architectural debate has to be about a sort of utopian thing of architecture will cure all the things that are wrong in contemporary society, and which can all be linked up to whatever the most unpopular recent phase of architecture is, and it will create a new utopian situation, but through specific form. The triumph of conservation was achieved partly by saying that modernism was very anti-conservation, and then that's continued to be accepted because it was in the founding myths of present-day conservation. All phases of architectural rhetoric are pretty much the same, Intrinsically, yeah. I don't think you can be surprised at that. Until the whole structure of architectural and built environment debate is reformed, and which it isn't going to be, then this sort of extreme discussions are going to carry on, and I don't think there's much that can be done about it.